President, I ask, it's not going to be that long, but may I ask unanimous consent to speak for up to half an hour as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today is my 258th time to wake up speech, and I want to use this occasion to take us back to our oceans. But before I get into the substance of my remarks, I want to note that this will be the last time to wake up speech that Adina Liebman has been with me. She has been closely involved in all of my office's oceans work, has indeed led it. She came to my office as a Knauss Fellow. We love Dean Knauss in Rhode Island. He was the Dean of the Graduate School of Oceanography at the University of Rhode Island, and working with Senator Pell, helped launch NOAA, helped start the Sea Grant program, and has been extremely significant in the ocean work of our government. So being a Knauss Fellow, one of the Knauss legacies, is a really big deal, and it's a particularly big deal in Rhode Island. She's been coordinating the oceans work now for 4 years and has also been coordinating our appropriations work. In the time that Adina has been working on this, the Bipartisan Oceans Caucus, which Senator Murkowski and I established, has grown to 40 members. It is very bipartisan. It is very effective. We set it up as a working caucus, and it is working. Adina helped us get the Coastal Resiliency Fund passed into law. It is now producing tens of millions of dollars in grants for coastal communities who need the support as sea levels rise. She helped get Save Our Seas Act passed. That was a unanimous effort. Dan Sullivan of Alaska was a remarkable partner in all of that. And the participants in that, including leaders from landlocked states like Senator Inhofe, was a real leader in that bill, had such a good time with it that we're now working on Save Our Seas 2.0, which today came through the Commerce Committee after having passed Foreign Relations Committee unanimously and Environment Public Works Committee unanimously. So we're hoping that soon we'll be able to organize floor consideration of it and perhaps pass it by unanimous consent the way we did Save Our Seas. And the work of all of that progress in those committees and of negotiating Save Our Seas 2.0 was led by Adina. And last, I started going around this week collecting co-sponsors for Senator Murkowski's and my Blue Globe Act, the oceans data bill that we have worked on and are now ready to launch. And an enormous amount of preparatory work goes into getting that ready, getting supporters lined up, doing all the work, cross-referencing the different points of view, and getting a bill that we also hope stands a good chance of passing this body by unanimous consent. So I give this speech with gratitude to Adina for her work. The oceans, Mr. President, send a clear and consistent signal about climate change. And it's a signal that has been untainted by fossil fuel industry propaganda attacks that have been problematic in other areas. And for good reason, the signals are untainted, because it's hard to dispute sea level rise measured with tide gauges all around the country. It's hard to dispute acidification that is measured with the kind of pH test kit that a middle school science classroom has. And it's hard to dispute rising ocean temperatures that are measured with that complex analytical device, the thermometer. So even the fossil fuel industry has trouble fouling the climate signals from our oceans. The recent special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate confirms through grim data that the health of our oceans is in rapid decline. And it confirms that these changes are caused not by nature, but by man. Headlines extracted from the report are pretty alarming. These are quotes. The global ocean has taken up more than 90% of the excess heat in the climate system. The rate of ocean warming has more than doubled. Marine heat waves are increasing in intensity. The ocean has undergone increasing ocean acidification. Mean sea level is rising. Increases in tropical cyclone winds and rainfall, increases in extreme waves, in extreme sea level events, and coastal hazards, multiple climate-related hazards. And the ocean, as if that's not enough, quote, is projected to transition to unprecedented conditions. It's a grim warning. Look at acidification. Ocean acidification is a chemical phenomenon. It's not deniable. You can replicate it in a middle school science lab. You can demonstrate it with your breath and a glass of water and an aquarium bubbler and pH strips, as I have done from this desk. The oceans absorbed around 30% of our excess CO2 emissions in a chemical interaction that takes up the CO from the air into the seawater, but it acidifies the seawater. Off our west coast, the humble pteropod is a building block in the oceanic food chain. Studies show pteropods suffering, quote, severe shell damage, worsened by acidification. It's hard to make and maintain a shell in acidifying seas. Coral reefs are dying from acidification. The great ocean die-offs in geologic eras before humans existed were signaled by ocean acidification. So that's serious. Look at heat. The oceans absorb over 90%, not 30% like the CO2, 90% of the excess atmospheric heat that we have trapped in our atmosphere with greenhouse gas emissions. So think about it. All the terrestrial effects that we are already seeing from climate change come from less than 1/10 of the excess heat that we have trapped. The heat going into the oceans is sparing us humans a real catastrophe. But all that heat is changing the oceans. It's 4 Hiroshima-sized bombs worth of heat energy added to our oceans every second. 4 Hiroshima explosions worth of heat energy per second is the rate of ocean heating. And the rate of this ocean heating has already doubled, and the ocean's projected to absorb from 5 to 7 times more heat by 2100. So it's heating, and the rate at which it's heating is accelerating. What does that mean? Well, warming seas expand. That's a basic law of physics. And along with melting glaciers and ice sheets, that means seas rise. So far, about 6 inches globally. On Rhode Island shores, already nearly a foot. On our current trajectory, more than 3 feet globally by 2100, more than 6 feet along our shores in Rhode Island. This is northern Rhode Island, this is Narragansett Bay, and all these areas that you see that are blue are land now. They're people's homes, they're people's businesses, there are roads and infrastructure, all projected to disappear, all projected to be swallowed by rising seas by the end of the century if we keep fiddling around here and not paying attention. The First Street Foundation calculates that coastal communities like these, along our East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico states, have already lost more than $15 billion in relative property values as the insurance and mortgage markets start to look at sea level rise and flooding, and it affects housing prices. In Rhode Island alone, they estimate about $45 million in relative property value lost. And predicted ahead is a coastal property values crash. That's not coming from an environmental organization. That's coming from Freddie Mac, the great American mortgage corporation. And it's global. The New York Times recently reported new research that, and I quote, some 150 million people are now living on land that will be below the high tide line by mid-century. 150 million people. A UK study warns global sea level rise could cost $14 trillion annually by 2100. Hang on, let me put this one back up, because this is what Freddie Mac has to say about this coastal property values crash. The economic losses and social disruption of the coastal property values crash may happen gradually, but they're likely to be greater in total than those experienced in the housing crisis and Great Recession. Those of us who lived through the 2008 meltdown, we don't want to go there again. Freddie Mac is forecasting that it's going to happen because of coastal property values. Look here to the Pacific. A new Climate Central study shows that, and I quote it, chronic coastal flooding or permanent inundation threatens areas occupied by more than 10% of the current population of nations, including Bangladesh, Vietnam, and many small island developing states. Here is the southern part of Vietnam swallowed up by high tide in 2050. That was the projection just a few years ago for the flooding that was going to come into the Vietnam Delta area, up here, Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon. This is the new projection for 2050. All of it underwater, including a good part of Saigon City. As one of the authors of the report said, most sea level rise here between now and 2050 is already baked in. Decades more of sea level rise means the fate of many coastal communities here and around the world is already sealed, which may explain the 2013 warning by the commander of our United States forces in the Pacific that upheaval related to climate change, and I quote him here, is probably the most likely thing that is going to happen that will cripple the security environment. He said, you have the real potential here in the not too distant future of nations displaced by rising sea level. If it goes bad, you could have hundreds of thousands or millions of people displaced. And then security will start to crumble pretty quickly. Well, here it is, as predicted by our Navy, 2013. Thankfully, countries around the globe are awakening to the problems in our oceans. In 2015, I fought to protect a mention of oceans in the Paris Climate Agreement. This year's original host, Chile, christened the entire upcoming climate meeting a blue COP with a blue vision of repairing ocean health. I attended as a U.S. congressional delegation of one this year's International Our Ocean Conference in Oslo, where advocates, corporations, and governments around the world, even the helpless Trump administration, made national and corporate and regional ocean commitments. Norway leads a panel of 14 nations, 14 heads of state, and the United States Special Envoy for the Ocean, advised by people like our own former NOAA Administrator, Jane Lubchenco. A recent panel report outlined 5 major ocean initiatives that could reduce 20% of global emissions by 2050. The United Nations also declared the 2020s the decade of ocean science for sustainable development. The world has turned toward action on oceans. Now, usually, in confronting threats of this magnitude, the United States sets an example of leadership. We are abandoning that tradition. In conversations about climate change and ocean challenges, the U.S. is, at best, absent. At worst, we're the obstruction. That's a mistake. The United States should not lose its place as an international leader, not if we care about our vaunted role as the indispensable nation, not if we care about the security and prosperity of our democracy. It doesn't have to be this way. Other ocean threats have prompted Congress to do what's right. We passed international fisheries treaties and the Port States Measures Enforcement Law. We did it unanimously here in the Senate. And now satellites are seeking out and tracking pirate fishing ships to bring them to justice. We passed that first marine plastics legislation unanimously, and a bigger, better marine plastics bill is moving in the Senate right now. Senator Murkowski and I are moving the biggest ocean data bill since NOAA was founded through our bipartisan Oceans Caucus. So yeah, we can do better, and we must. Henry Kissinger once told me that the great revolutions of the world have come about from what he called a confluence of resentments. Well, the poorest, those who depend most closely on the oceans, those who lead subsistence lives, will suffer most the brunt of the coming crisis, and they will resent it. Look at fisheries. The poorest starve when their fisheries collapse. Others are distressed when fisheries collapse, but have the resources to migrate or find alternative food sources. For wealthy nations like ours, the fish in our air-conditioned supermarkets may cost a bit more, but our lives aren't seriously affected. But when the poor and distressed are hurt like that, they will resent it. That is human nature. And if you turn the pain up high enough, well, good luck defending to them the systems of parliamentary democracy and market capitalism that countenanced their suffering. Years ago, Daniel Webster described the work of our founders as having set the world an example. He went on to say, "The last hopes of mankind, therefore, rest with us." From Jonathan Winthrop to Ronald Reagan, we've called America the city on a hill, set high for the world to witness. President Clinton argued that people around the world have always been more impressed by the power of our example than any example of our power. We still tout our system of democracy and capitalism as a beacon of success and progress, but we have aided and abetted the failure of our system to address the climate and oceans crisis. And worst of all is the reason for it: the fossil fuel industry's menacing climate denial apparatus. That apparatus may have won the day influencing Congress for now, but it will surely fail the test of time. History will judge harshly an American generation that let its democracy be corrupted by this industry. The voice of the oceans is more lasting than the greed and folly of man, and it warns of consequences driven by laws of chemistry, physics, and biology. These stern natural laws cannot be repealed or vetoed. Propaganda can manipulate people, passions, and politics, but propaganda cannot change the immutable laws of nature. The data are the voice of the oceans, and if data could scream, the oceans would now be screaming. So, to paraphrase a poem, let us be the voice the sea would have if it had not a better one, as it lifts its rumbling, deep structured roar. Let us wake up and get to our duty. Slap nature, Pope Francis said, and she will slap you back. Mr. President, we have a hell of a slap coming if we don't get ahead of this, and we'd better wake up to it. I yield the floor.